There are a couple of things that I want to reciprocate in terms of my pleasure at being here and being associated with the Center for the Environment, which I think is just a phenomenally wonderful organization in a phenomenally wonderful building, gives architecture a good name. Not all the buildings in Salisbury necessarily do that, but some do. This is an outstanding piece of architecture with an outstanding program and an outstanding director and outstanding faculty and students. And one of the things we talked about over supper was how our urban design program in Charlotte and the programs here can do business together. We are natural allies. The fact that I use the word ally sort of suggests that we might be involved in some kind of conflict or some kind of fight. And I'm going to suggest probably I'm going to be polite. You know, we English are taught to be polite, and we're taught understatement. So you'll need some translation, perhaps. But I am going to suggest that there are severe challenges, many of which are of our own making. Now, we may be the good guys here. We may have a variety of opinions about issues. Our politics may be different. There was something I read in the Charlotte Business Journal on my iPhone. My wife and I have just got iPhones. We were sort of we swore we'd be the last people on earth to get iPhones, and you know, we're not. We're hooked. And so I was reading the Charlotte Business Journal. She was driving, I was reading. And there's a piece in today's sort of electronic version. The Minister of State, the British Minister of State for Climate Change, was talking in Charlotte to business leaders. I don't know if anybody's read that on the internet. There was a report, in the Charlotte Business Journal. And amongst the things he said, in fact, the thing he said that was most important, this is someone from the Conservative Party, our sort of equivalent to the Republican Party. You know, you can't really equate the left and the right in European and American politics. It's too complex. But this is someone from the Conservative Party who is the Minister for Climate Change. And he said, everybody in the government, everybody in Parliament, whatever side of the spectrum they're on, believes climate change is real, it's urgent, and it's very important that we unite, and we're bipartisan. He used the word bipartisan many times, apparently, in his talk. He, perhaps, being English, is somewhat naive about American politics. He may know a lot more than I give him credit for. But clearly we are suffering from a lack of bipartisanship, and I'm going to suggest, in part, that is where the problem lies. I'm not going to tell you anything this evening that most of you either don't know, because you're good professionals. I have no magic solutions, no magic destination that one of the signposts is going to point to. We're going to run through is essentially what needs to happen, and we're going to ask ourselves, how can we bring that about? This slide is one of my early experiences with bad air. Those of you who are near the front might be able to read this. It says Newcastle upon Tyne, 1970. That's where I did my graduate thesis in urban design. Working in that community, a working class community on the banks of the River Tyne, opposite a power station. You can see, perhaps you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 smokestacks. Those smokestacks reappear. So if you can't see them on this slide, you'll see them on another one. And clearly, people are living and dying in that environment. And it took quite a long time. There's the smokestacks. So you can see all this stuff, right? Again, 1970. And eventually, as it says at the bottom, that was cleaned up with great effort. This happens to be a piece of Union County. It could be Rowan, very similar, beautiful landscape. Happens to be Union County. That's now an asphalt parking lot with a big box store. And we did that very easily. The point being, obviously, we despoil our environment with great ease, we reclaim it with great difficulty. But it is possible to reclaim it, but wouldn't it be nice if we designed things that didn't have to be reclaimed? And as we navigate across this landscape of complex issues, partial solutions, etc., you've probably done this kind of little listing yourself. You know, how do we deal with all these issues? They're interrelated, but clearly we can think about energy in terms of its sourcing, and we can think about pollution in terms of controlling emissions, etc. So they're obviously interrelated, energy and pollution, but we can think of them sort of separately before we reintegrate them. And these are questions. You know, I mean, you can read. I'm not going to read them out. I'm assuming that you're awake and you can read them, and the type is big enough. Should we be doing that? How many think we should be doing that? Okay. So there is a clear sentiment, I think, that yes, we should keep searching and utilizing what we have so we can keep our lifestyle, we can keep all our investments intact, etc., etc. So that attitude of keeping going, trying to maintain what we have, and mining and extracting energy is definitely one option. It's quite a favored option. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about energy independence, but clearly the more we utilize our own resources, we become more or less dependent on foreign sources. The issue is, what are the consequences of that? And so the alternative question is, can we change our energy sources? Can we orchestrate enough energy from cleaner sources, renewable resources, and still maintain a reasonably affluent, convenient lifestyle? This is a huge issue. We see lots and lots of images, and I'll show some, of windmills and solar panels and biomass boilers, with the implication that if we put all this stuff together, we can probably fabricate a decent enough life. It'll be different, but it'll be different substantially enough that we need to plan for it. We'll see something later on called energy descent planning. And so these seem to be, to me, to epitomize two different attitudes, and probably, as pragmatists, we'll do both, and we'll manage them pragmatically. This one, I think, is a little more straightforward. I get nervous about the promise of future technologies in case they don't arrive. On the other hand, we are an incredibly inventive people, and there are things that we now take for granted, like iPhones, for example, that I certainly couldn't have imagined 25 years ago. So some would argue that it's a reasonable bet that yes, we can invent our way out of future problems. The opposite viewpoint is that that's too risky a bet, and we should in fact change our lifestyles to lessen the possibility of failure of technology to deliver. And once again, being pragmatic, we'll probably make some kind of British-style fudge about doing both. But the first signpost is really obvious, that's why the exclamation point is there, that if we did use less energy, we wouldn't need to produce so much of it, and we would produce lower emissions, and therefore we would get firmly on the road to cleaner air. So that seems to be a reasonable signpost that however we stand in our own opinions about these questions, if we generally head in the direction of using less energy, and I don't think anybody in the audience can read the license plate. It says this is a smart car, obviously, painted like a cow. It belongs to a dairyman near my home in England, and the registration is Moo Cow. Right? My wife and I stumbled across this literally on a trip a few years ago, and just snapped it. But the idea, of course, that smart car is a lifestyle choice. It's not something you'd use on the freeways, although you do see them occasionally. It's got limited functionality and only makes sense in certain circumstances. But if your lifestyle is such that travel can be local, travel can be small, buying things regularly in small amounts so you don't, this is not a car you go to Costco in, right? I mean, you couldn't even get the paper towels in the back, right? I mean, you just couldn't. So you make one trip for paper towels, another for the toilet rolls, another for the, we buy boxes of San Pellegrino fizzy water. I mean, it's just, we carry one box at a time. So clearly, using different types of technology is as much a lifestyle choice as it is anything else. Now, this is a slide I had to cobble together from someone else's PowerPoint, and so this piece isn't very clear. But this graph, I'll explain it briefly, comes from an EPA study recently published this year, and it looks at what it calls location efficiency. That is, how much energy you use in your daily life. And the results end up showing, not surprisingly, if you live and work and recreate and live your life in a more compact spatial arrangement, you use far less energy than if you have if you do those same sorts of things in what's called a conventional suburban development. So these sets of graphs. These two are the energy expenditure in single-family housing, single-family detached housing, equivalent energy expenditure in single-family attached townhomes, essentially, and then multifamily, so duplexes, fourplexes, apartments. And the black is transportation energy use, the gray is home energy use, and then the dark green are if you have say a Prius or an energy efficient vehicle, you get that reduction. If you've got a well-insulated energy efficient home, you get that reduction. And this is conventional suburban development. This is compact transit oriented development. And so you can see there's a general trend down. So not surprisingly, we use less energy in our everyday lives if we live in a duplex and ride the light rail. Right? Now, not everybody can do that. But if that was more freely available, possibly more people would do that. And therefore, overall, nationally, our energy use would go down, our emissions would go down, and in time, because physics doesn't work automatically, the air would clearly become cleaner. So that's one of the things that the EPA study did, and I've got another graph in a moment. But this is basically saying what I just said with a couple of pictures. This is Davidson, North Carolina. That is the light rail and some very expensive apartments. If you live here with a view of uptown, I think the rent is $3,000 a month. So if you live on the backside and you look at the parking lot, $1,000, do it. The apartment's really nice. The view is worth $2,000 apparently a month. But I did go around the show units, and they are really cool. If someone would pay me to live there, I'd be very happy. But clearly, we're not talking about living that densely. We're talking about something like this, a walkable neighborhood with housing choices, with travel choices, with a whole range of housing types, but built in certain locations that make more sense than others, and built to connect to other developments, and built in compact ways that make, however we get around, driving, cycling, skateboarding, segwaying, walking, it's just more convenient because things are planned in closer proximity. And this is the huge challenge. I think this is probably the biggest challenge that we face overall, and so that's why I've called it signpost number 3, because it points to this high hurdle, this huge challenge, that changing the ways we live, if we lived in more compact, mixed-use neighborhoods, not necessarily high-rise, it could be 2, 3 floors, 1 to 3 floors, if we lived that way, we could make the biggest difference to the planet. We know how to do it. Joe knows how to do it. There's several folks here in the design and planning and environmental professions who know how to do this. Theoretically, it's not that hard. We've got most of the tools that we would ever need. Politically, and not just politically with a big P in politicians, but politically in terms of community activism and community dynamics, this is incredibly difficult. But the science is sort of pretty compelling. I mean, here's another chart, this time from Criterion Planners. This is pounds of CO2 per person per year. That's you and me creating CO2 through the way we live. And if we live in a normal suburb, 53,000 pounds per year per person. And you can see it's sort of more or less half and half, but transportation is still the biggest amount. How we move around, I mean, if these were the greenest buildings in the world, but they were in the wrong place, it still would make less difference than if these were leaky buildings in the right place. That isn't to say that we should have leaky buildings, don't get me wrong. We should have very efficient, well-designed buildings. But the main issue is transportation. Now, if we live in a mixed-use urban neighborhood, then clearly those, our individual production of CO2 goes down quite dramatically. What that means, and you've all seen illustrations like this, this actually could be Innis Street. Joe, I bet at some point you or someone in your department or local architects and have done, if that's Innis Street now, that's what Innis Street could become. Every community has one of these. Charlotte, of course, has several. You can take your pick. And there's nothing there that is rocket science in any way. We know that we should make a good pedestrian environment, and we do that by bringing buildings closer to the street, providing on-street convenient parking, and hiding the other longer-term parking behind the building. Our streets are, in our jargon, multimodal. That means they're walkable, they're bikeable, they're drivable, they're transit-friendly, et cetera, that you can use them in any number of ways. They're easy to get across. They're environmentally mitigated by things like bioswales, so that the water doesn't just swoosh into the drains. We're not going to talk about water issues particularly, but it's all connected. So that we know how to do this, and every community in the country almost of any size and sophistication has a plan that calls for that. Am I right that we do have one for Innis Street which sort of looks like that? And from your own professional so contacts, that drawings like that, photoshopped in almost every planning department in every major town has that stuff. But it exists as Photoshop renderings. It doesn't get done. I mean, there is absolutely nothing technically advanced about that. Of course, it's money. These streetcars don't come free. Some cities have them. Some cities choose to invest. Others don't. It's a matter of public and political opinion, resource management. In short, it's all our political decision-making as to whether, if, say, Salisbury, just to use Salisbury as we're here, really got behind a program to transform Inner Street. I doubt if we'd have the streetcar. That's probably, that's for the next city scale up. But we could have everything else on that image. And if the political will and if the public-private partnership financing and if creative leveraging of resources took place, 5 years' time, Inner Street could look like that. Nothing stopping it except nobody wants it enough. If we really wanted it, surely it would happen. Oh, I probably didn't say that loud enough. If we really wanted it, surely that would happen. There's lots of advice out there. Ding, 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 buy the book. There are much better, there's just as good books up here. This one is a very good book, written by an architect and urban designer at Georgia Tech. And so this represents academia. Although I spend quite a bit of my time in practice, I earn most of my living as an academic. So this is academia. This is the Urban Land Institute. This is developers. Developers and people like me say exactly the same thing, which is very unusual. In fact, my wife and I can chart in Charlotte's history the sort of precise moment when we realized the earth had shifted. Our life had changed, because from 1990, when we first moved here, till about 1998, or late 90s, I was often asked to speak at sort of realtors, luncheons, developers, conferences, this, that, and the other. And I was usually the after-dinner speaker, and you're supposed to be funny. And so I would talk about smart growth, I would talk about regional planning, and people would fall over laughing. These were these weird ideas that academics had, or especially foreign academics who just didn't know what they were talking. It was so funny. There was such a gulf between what we were arguing for and what the development community did. And then, I think it was probably 1998, I was part of a panel at the now defunct Borders in Charlotte's South Park. And there were two developers. There was Todd Mansfield, who was the CEO of Crosland, probably Charlotte's biggest, most influential developer, and then Peter Pappas of Pappas Properties, who's also done quite a lot of, actually really pretty good. They're both quite good developers. And we were on a forum about this kind of stuff, smart growth, yada, yada. And we didn't have any order about who would go first, and so it worked out just by, I think, coin toss, that the two developers went first, and I was going to be third. And so, I was going to say my normal stuff about smart growth, about being, sensible design, good urban design, hiding the parking, walkable streets, all this kind of stuff. And developer number one, Todd Mansfield, one of the nation's top developers, was involved in Celebration down in Florida, for example. He talks about walkable neighborhoods, mixed use, transit-supported development, and I thought, what? Then Peter Pappas gets up and talks about exactly the same stuff. So I go in third, have nothing to talk about. Because the developers have given my talk. And so I got up and I said, the developers have just given my talk. And then we discussed, wasn't that interesting? I'd gone from being the butt of developers' humor for the last 9 years in after-dinner speeches to being the cheerleading section after they'd given their talk. And that was a phenomenally important shift. And for the first decade of the 21st century, there has been this quite astonishing convergence between academic theory and good planning practice and profitable development. It was a sort of golden age, if you will. And then, of course, the recession came, and all bets got shelved, not abandoned, but shelved. And so we're having to build that consensus again. And so we're going through some of the basic things again. There's a lot of misunderstanding. When I talk about transit-oriented development, compact development, people think that it's high-rise, I sometimes think people willfully want to misunderstand. So I show slides like this. This happens to be the Dilworth neighborhood in Charlotte. We'll see that development over there in the next slide. But this is very compact, walkable development. It's at densities ranging from 4 dwellings an acre to 30 dwellings an acre. Completely within the planning density ranges of compact transit-oriented development. So, if you want to know what transit-oriented development looks like, it can look just like that. And there is that courtyard again. My wife and I lived here for, 10 years nearly? Yeah, she's nodding at the back, got that right. 10 years. You can see, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. 30 units an acre. It's about 29 point something. And it's right next to single-family homes. My point being, as I say there, and you can read along as I say the same thing in slightly different words, if we tried to build an infill development of 30 units an acre, I'm going to put Joe on the spot again. You shouldn't have come. Well, you certainly shouldn't have sat on the front row. But if someone came into a nice neighborhood, single-family neighborhood in Salisbury, and said, I'm going to build 30 units an acre next, on that little infill site, what would the good public of Salisbury do? Yeah, suffice it to say, you're being very diplomatic. People would hate it. Right? People would hate it. They would march on Joe's office. They'd march on the mayor's office. They'd write to the Salisbury Post. And not only Salisbury, Charlotte, Huntersville, Wilmington, Raleigh, Atlanta, Dallas, everywhere. Some people like sprawl, so we mustn't, and you can build a wonderful, if you've got the resources, you can build a really nice life in a spread out environment. Our worry is we can't keep doing that, and when circumstances change, those low-density, spread-out environments become unsustainable. And they become, some people have gone so far. What's his name, Lineberger, his new book, The Option of Urbanism, goes so far as to suggest that these wealthy, far-flung suburbs are actually going to be the slums of 2030, 2040, 2050, simply because it's an unsustainable lifestyle and people won't be able to live there because gas will have gone up. The whole idea of driving long distances for everything will become possibly seen as anti-American, a great waste of our natural resources, weakening our country. There's lots of people who think that. But anyway, this is a fabulous place. It's recognized as one of America's great apartment complexes. You couldn't build it today. People would rally to stop that. And yet the houses next door are $400,000 and up, partly because it's such a nice place. But we keep going. Urban designers, town planners, architects are nothing if not optimistic. we're like those, carnival dolls with the sand in the bottom that you punch them and they bounce back up. You're boing, way! Yeah. Oh, bam, hey! So we keep trying because we know that we've got to succeed in some part. And Salisbury now has, after several years, some really decent modern buildings in the right place, doing the right thing, using less energy, supporting in their own individual way a larger vision. You've got to piece this together. This isn't the command and control economy of China. I mean, China is beating the pants off us at this game. It really is quite humbling. I was reading yesterday, China has now passed Great Britain in the number of scientific papers published and the number of PhDs. Now, the number of PhDs, China is bigger than Britain, right? So just by law of averages, you're going to get more Chinese PhDs than English PhDs, or Scottish or Welsh or Irish. But the actual quantity of pure scientific research coming out of China has displaced Britain as the number 2 generator of new knowledge. And projections are it will eclipse America, that is number 1 at the moment. In 2 years, China will be producing more scientific knowledge than America. They're outperforming us in every other respect, so I'm not sure why we might be surprised about that. They've cornered the solar panel market, they've cornered the wind power market, they've cornered the high-speed rail market. If we ever build high-speed rail in America, it'll be largely built by Chinese companies. But despite all this, we are optimists. That we say, right, we lost that one, but let's try this one. And so, we're not going to turn into Stuttgart overnight, for example. We're not going to have integrated, car, bus, tram, bicycle ways, with a high-density node next to very exclusive single-family mansions. We're not going to get there anytime soon, but it doesn't stop us trying. Now, this unpromising slide is a piece of South Charlotte. The blue line up here is actually the light rail. And this is the Arrowwood station, just a park and ride facility. This is a faded big box store. So going out of, there's another this is a dead Walmart over here. So this is a fairly typical failing suburban scene. We have them everywhere. And before the recession, a developer was planning to do this. First of all, build a townhome community within walking distance of the trains, easy walking distance of the train station. A townhome community, relatively uncontroversial, probably fairly easy to get approved, using well-established house types. Get the footprint on the ground. Follow that up with some higher density apartments around a parking deck, some larger, more sort of garden apartments, but connecting streets to make everything walkable. And then as the market gathers momentum, redevelop the failed commercial area into a mixed use, a civic building, a church, a library, a little government office, a police house, something of that order. And that was the developer's vision. It worked very well with Charlotte planners' vision. Once again, the planner's view and the developer's view were very much in sync. And then, of course, same story. Along comes the recession, and complicated schemes like this are just put aside. And it'll be quite a while before the development financing for anything on this scale, probably 10 years, we're probably 10 years away from even beginning to do that kind of stuff again. We're not going to forget how to do it. In fact, we might even learn how to do it better, incorporate better water quality. There's some attempt at managing water quality, stormwater runoff, bioswales, detention ponds, best practices, etc. We can get better at that. But that's the kind of development that will bring about substantial reductions in CO2 emissions, substantial reductions in all forms of pollution, because people live there will use about half the energy of people who live in standard, low-density, spread-out suburbia. So back to signpost number 1, if we're ever going to get a handle on this, we've got to use less energy. And just upgrading suburbia in terms of greener houses and greener cars isn't going to do it. We've got to change the pattern of suburbia. And we also need to get over this rail thing. I mean, this is where I have to declare again that I'm a foreigner, and sometimes, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Because I am baffled by the opposition to high-speed rail. Every other industrialized, post-industrial nation in the world is investing in high-speed rail as fast as it can. Spain, you've heard the Spanish economy is a basket case. It's one of the countries next on the European Central Bank's list for a major bailout. Massive overbuilding of apartments, construction industry in shambles. They're investing $193 billion to make the best high-speed rail system in Europe. Their aim is to be better than the Germans. Stated government policy. So they're broke, and they're investing $193 billion in infrastructure, which they feel will get them back. And that's something else that the British Minister for Climate Change said in Charlotte yesterday. He said, dealing with climate change is the only way to get out of the economic recession in good shape. Taking advantage of this opportunity to retool, to re-gear. Everybody is united over there, my side of the pond, that the green economy is the answer. High-speed rail is an essential component of that. Yet, North Carolina seems to be joining other states in a rush to, quote unquote, kill rail grants. That's what I don't understand. Now, this is a map you can't read, but you can probably make out Spain, right? Portugal, Spain, right? See all the red lines? $193 billion worth of red lines. France, Germany, the blue lines are mere sort of 125 mile an hour trains. The red lines are, the next generation of 250 to 300 kilometers per hour. Last summer, my wife and I caught the train from Venice to Paris, and it was one of these, incredibly high-speed trains, except that all the way across northern Italy into the bottom half of France, it went at about 50 miles an hour. Because, just going through tunnels and and we thought, are we on the right train? I mean, it was very nice. The service came through and everybody was nice. And we kept looking at and we said, we're never going to get to Paris on time. And then, as soon as darkness fell, it just happened that way, we speeded up. And we went at 200 miles an hour the rest of the way. We went, actually, if you see that this bit is, well, you might see that bit straight. This bit goes, and then you come here and you go, whoa! 200 miles an hour, Paris, just like that. And we were pulling in, we were slowing down, and we thought, oh, we stopping again? And it was Paris. Because it doesn't look like Paris in the dark when you pull in by train, but I mean, it was. And so the This is the economic backbone of Europe. It's going to be the economic backbone of China. It's going to be the economic backbone of most of America's competitor nations. So, as I said, I'm going to be quiet. I want you to read that. Only rail travel can provide us with the communications that we need with reductions in emissions and pollution levels, because it can run on power produced from anything. From any number of sources can feed the grid. It seems to me that, we're clearly in a difficult position in terms of our choices of energy sources. So we're likely to have to use almost everything. But you can't fly a jet plane on biomass. You can't truck your stuff across the country on wind power. But you can power an electric train by both of those and everything. So it seems to me that if you look at this logically, that high-speed rail is an essential component of meeting our desires for cleaner air, for increased energy efficiency, energy independence, call it what you will. And to me, therefore, as a foreigner, it is totally bemusing why there is so much opposition. The Charlotte Business Journal, one of my main sources of news, as you can gather, they conducted a poll about this. And predictably, most of the people who subscribe to the Charlotte Business Journal are not like me. They are, pro-business, government out of the way kind of types, and there's a lot of respect that is due to that position in part. But so the poll was totally dismissive of this whole idea of rail travel. But I picked out these quotes because it's symptomatic of something other than if there was a rational economic argument that was put forward to counter what I've just suggested, that would demand respect. This stuff doesn't demand our respect. This stuff is stupid. But Americans aren't stupid any more than Brits are stupid. Well, we have some stupid Brits, right? But everybody has some stupid people. But Americans are generally pretty intelligent, and yet we get that kind of opinion driving public policy, almost. Because there are plenty of elected officials who will ride that wave of negativity into some kind of political power. And that's a problem. Meanwhile, countries less hampered by partisan politics, witness, the very clear message from the British Conservative government minister. The way forward is bipartisan agreement on quite radical new ways to tackle climate change. That's the way we will build and evolve our way out of this recession. Whether you're a left-wing politician or a centrist, a right-wing politician, you agree and you collaborate and you fund. And in that supportive context, you get more individual slightly strange. I can say that because this is my hometown, which you'll see in a minute, that it's an interesting little market town in a very nice part of southwest England, and it is the home of the transition town movement, from oil dependency to local resilience. And as part of that, Transition in Action, Totnes District 2030, an Energy Descent Action Plan. You can download this from the net if you, I haven't got the reference with me, but if you Google Totnes Transition Energy Descent Action Plan, you can download a sort of 200-page document. Or you can fly to England at the cost of huge emissions and go to Totnes and buy the book, which is what we did, right? Very energy efficient, David. Yes, absolutely. It is part romantic, which is somewhat silly in some ways, but in other ways quite charming, and in a very hard way, realistic. Because people respond, people bond, people collaborate around something that tugs at their emotions. It's not just cold, hard science about doing this, using less, this, that, and the other. It's a community vision of a different kind, living well, but living with less and living differently. We're full of environmental friendly cafes and takeaways. It's an organic farmers and organic food, even organic wine. My wife and I disagree about very little. British wine is one thing that we don't agree on. I have to fool her into drinking it. But there is, in my hometown, I'm very proud of Totnes, right? There's a wonderful winery, which, if you go there, don't drink the red. But the white, excellent. It actually beat French whites at a taste testing, blind taste testing. And last time we were there, my wife said, "Oh, will you go up and get me a glass of white wine?" I said, "What do you want?" And she said, probably Pinot Grigio or Sauvignon Blanc or whatever. And so I went up and I bought some Totnes white wine. And that was nice. And until I told her what it was. I exaggerate, of course. But it's a local economy. That's, oddly enough, that's a benefit of global warming. Our soil types in Totnes are exactly the same as in the Champagne region of France. But it's colder, right? A little bit wetter, but generally colder. Except now that it isn't. The climate conditions which produce great French wines are seeping across the channel. The French are really worried because they're going to turn into Tuscany, right? And we are going to turn into the Loire Valley or something, which is not bad. So in that way, I'm in favor of global warming, but it's a very local benefit not to be weighed very heavily against the downside. But there's a determined effort to just be local, and this is obviously and there's a similar movement in the States. I mean, I've got a dozen books which I didn't put in the slideshow, all about living small, local economies beating Walmart, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there about the localization of all aspects of our economy, except energy. It's really hard to produce energy locally, other than through the sort of universal renewable sources of wind and sun. If you live on the coast, you have tide power, tide energy. But if you live inland, you don't have that. So that's a hard one. That's very much a work in production. But there is this determined effort to be a local entity, having a local economy within a globalized economy, so that as that global economy shifts, and sometimes shifts for the worse, there is a buffer of insulation and self-sufficiency, resilience to local life. And if you combine that with, somewhat slightly weird-looking designs, now this is the Z, but if it was an American book, it would be the Z book, of course, but, we just get it wrong. We say it's a Z. It reminds me, I'm going to show my age, but there's enough people my age in the audience to remember who ZZ Top was. Are they still going? Right. Their first visit to the UK, they appeared on this, pop show, Top of the Pops it was called. I remember, I was watching, and the DJ said, "Now, the latest American sensation, Z Top." Right? So we didn't know any better. I was always confused by songs which went, from A to Z. I never knew what Z was. So excuse us for saying Z, but the Z book, see, acronyms are on our side. Z, Zero Energy Development. This is really the invention of an architect called Bill Dunster, whose name appears in very small print there, who has done a great deal of work on buildings that both reduce their energy requirement and generate most of the energy, the reduced amount of energy that they need. And some of them are built in England. This is not far from my home, down in the southwest. In China, where most of the work is being done. And back to England, which by 2016, the National Building Code requires single-family homes to be carbon neutral. Zero emissions, carbon neutral. Nobody thinks we can do it, right? But it's government policy. So we're frantically trying to work out how to do it. Bill Dunster is one of the people who is active in that. We're actively trying to get the technology right so that we can substantially reduce both our need for energy and the emissions and the pollution that come from excessive use of energy. So this is the final question. Which infrastructure investment provides for cleaner air and it's a loaded, if ever there was a loaded question, right? A huge, rusty outer belt under construction, or cool trains that are fun to ride, right? But, we still pour billions into this. And, the whole, even if President Obama's whole high-speed rail thing got funded, even if every single bit got funded, which of course isn't going to happen, but if it did, that's 9.3 billion. Spain, which fits very handily into Texas, 193 billion. Now, 9's into 193, how many more times is that? It's over 20 times, isn't it? 29 is 180, right? So Spain is spending more than 20 times than the whole of America. And we're not going to spend the 9.1 billion because, we're all giving it back. We're rejecting it. It's tainted money for some reason. But which way shall we go? We know what the signposts say. I doubt if I've said anything that you didn't already know. If I did, I'm glad. It's part of my job to educate people, but I suspect that all I've done is reiterate or repackage wisdom that you already have. Because, we, well, I don't vote, but, I do jump up and down and shout a lot. But you decide how you act and who you elect. That seems to me to be the key issue. Are we going to elect people who don't get it in terms of things that need to happen? Or are we going to elect people who do get it? And that's why we care.